Assalamu alaikum wa as'adullah sabahakum.
Peace be upon you.
Medicine. You have individual A carry the genes which make him or her susceptible, say, to diabetes or high blood pressure. Individual B doesn't have that gene. Under specific circumstances, most likely, individual A will develop diabetes or high blood pressure. Individual B wouldn't do that, wouldn't develop that illness. He's not susceptible to the diabetes or high blood pressure. I think the state in the Middle East was born from the very beginning with a high degree of susceptibility to failure, to collapse, and to disintegration. Look, for example, at the situation at the moment in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, in Iraq, even in Lebanon, where the country almost standing on the brink. There are three major factors, I believe, structural defects which contributed to the situation, to the crisis of the state in the Middle East. The first one is the maximization of power of the state. And this, I think, started from the very beginning of modernization in the mid-19th century. The transformation of the state and the state-society relationship in the Middle East from the traditional state society into the modern, centralized, sovereign, pervasive state happened not as a result of social change, a change in the class situation, industrialization, or so forth. Happened by the decision of a smaller group of modernizing elite or by colonial officials in the country, in the countries which fell a bit earlier to the European colonization. In the old system, if you were a Muslim scholar and you have certain ideas about law or about society, you didn't need to capture the instrument of the state to propagate your vision or to rally people behind your idea. In the new situation, there was no way that you can change things without capturing the instrument of the state. This situation, of course, was exacerbated with the rise of ruling minorities, and I'm not talking here about only sectarian minorities, but sectarian, social, even sometimes people coming from certain region of the country, like, for example, in Iraq of Saddam Hussein. People coming from sectarian background, like, for example, the Syrian ruling elite, or a social force which monopolizes power in the country and perpetuates its control of the state institution, like the army in Egypt or the army in Algeria. In the 1960s, we had a new development. Things went a little bit further, starting from Nasserite Egypt, where we started to witness a kind of identification, total identification between the ruling elite and the state institutions. There was no longer any separation between who governed from time to time and the state structure and the state institution. And this was followed, of course, people in Algeria, in Syria, in Iraq, followed on the footsteps of what happened in Egypt. In monarchic countries, situation was even much worse. This, with the absence of democracy, this maximized the conflict over the state power almost everywhere in the Middle East. there was no change possible without military coup, armed insurgencies, or disruption and unpopular revolution. The second, I think, the second inherent defect of the state in the Middle East is the issue of borders. I mean, this part of the world didn't have the concept of sovereignty and borders for centuries. And when the state was founded, it was founded because of negotiations between foreign powers. There was borders did not express the will of the people, nor did they express natural situations, whether it is a situation of like war and ethnic or confessional or national cleansing, or natural barriers like rivers or mountains or whatever. And borders were not understood as demarking the limits of the state's sovereignty, but rather as solid barriers and sometimes steel barriers between people. And this is not an abstract issue, as many people would think. It touched the life of millions of people. Shammar, for example, is divided, the Shammar tribe is dividing between, you could be like a member of the Shammar tribe with Iraqi nationality, and your auntie or your uncle is with the Syrian passport. And for years, there was no movement possible between the Iraqis side of the border and the Syrian side of the borders. For years, haven't been any movement allowed between Western Algeria and Morocco. The people of Sinai, northern Sinai, and marginalized and excluded people in Egypt, they have a strong kinship with people of southern Palestine rather than the Egyptian valley. And this is the same thing, of course, with the tribes in western Egyptian desert. This of course undermined sense of loyalty to the state, and the people believe that the state is working on their behalf and for their own benefit. The third and the most important is the way nations were built, the way sense of nationness was instilled in these countries. I mean, the story of King Faisal and his realization that he wasn't able to rule Iraq without recreating a nation in Iraq is very well known. But in most cases, it was the state coercive power which was employed to create a nation and sense of nationness. And this, of course, resulted in the exclusion of huge chunks of the people. It created the Kurdish issue in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey and Iran. It created a problem about the relationship between the Shiite of Iran and the Shiite shrines in Iraq, and so forth. Nations were not built by consent, were not built by consensus, but I mean, like, we are here in Turkey, where most of these things started, of course, and many of you know how the new Turkish language was enforced in the country, how people in many areas of Turkey were forced to change their names and their family names. Situation, Arab nationalism of the Iraqi version was imposed by force in Iraq and resulted in the exclusion of a huge number of the Iraqi people. There are, of course, other manifestations of the state crisis, but unless these structural the effects of the state institution in the Middle East are dealt with, unless we have a change, democratic change in the country, unless we realize that nations can only be built by consent, unless we have reconsideration of the meaning of borders, unless the state, the ruling classes will be answerable to the will of the majority of the people, I don't think there will be any hope for stability or for a solution of the situation which allowed non-state actors to flourish all over the Middle East. Thank you.